So now take a look at these, and the kind of things I want us to kind of consider is this from two different perspectives. And one is that, okay, I think there is some kind of something about maybe what it means to be human that can connect our dreams to the ancient Israelite dreams. At the same time, I want you to kind of look at what we put up here and see how much we might have been writing the American dream back onto the Israelite dream and saying, oh, this is what we dream for, so let me just sub out stuff with sheep, and sub out wealth for having lots of land. So how much have we just taken the American dream and just been like, oh, we're just surely they have the same dreams we do, right? Which might not be the case. Right? How do we know? Where do we kind of hear about what the American dream is? Like, how does that get presented?
Media.
Media? What do you mean, media?
Well, television,
newspapers, magazines.
or you watch movies where you have this success story. Same thing, you watch love stories. Two people meet, they fall in love, they get married, and then people think, okay, yeah, that's...
Yeah, Jackson.
For me, it was family. Like, my granddad told me, you work hard, you get a job, you'll have a family.
Well,
You
yeah.
know what I mean?
Good. Yeah, Jen.
Same thing he said, he's called.
Right.
That comes into it too.
Yeah. I think you guys are hitting all around this because I think family and media, because where we get the idea of what our dreams are from stories so much of the time. Right? What do stories present? The stories that our parents pass down to us, the stories that media present to us. Right? Because all of the stories that we tell, there's themes, there's values, there's morals. Right? And so when we start asking ourselves, well, what would be the dreams or the hopes of a different culture, then one place we can look is at the kind of stories they tell and how they tell these stories. What are the themes in these stories? What are the values presented in their stories? Because when we do that, that's how we can understand what kind of defines their society. What are they hoping for? What are they striving for? What kind of things do they value? And where we find a really clear picture of these kinds of stories for the Hebrew people aren't just in Genesis through Deuteronomy, but we see it incredibly clear in Deuteronomy and especially in the books that are informed by Deuteronomy, which are Joshua through Kings. And that's the section of the Hebrew text that we refer to as the Deuteronomistic history. Okay. Now this is including 1st and 2nd Kings, right? Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay. Notice does anybody know which book I left out that's typically in the middle there in the Christian canon? Ruth, right? Ruth is with the writings in the Hebrew canon. She's not included in this section in the Hebrew writings. This section in the Hebrew writings, in the Hebrew text is referred to as the former prophets. So we are in the section that gets referred to as Nevi'im, right? Remember Tanakh? We've done Torah. Torah takes us from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Joshua all the way through the rest of the prophets is with the Nevi'im. However, when we talk about Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and Kings, we're talking about the former prophets. Okay.
So how you say it, Nevi'im?
Nevi'im, yeah.
Nevi'im, that, you said that consists of all of them though, right? The former and the latter?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So this is just kind of the first little chunk of that section in the Hebrew text. Right? So what we see when we look at Joshua through Kings, this is what we refer to as the Deuteronomistic history. I might sometimes just say DH because saying Deuteronomistic history gets a little long-winded. So what we see when we look at the DH is a very particular kind of way of telling a story. right? There is a particular, what we could say, ideology. Right? And we see this ideology in how American stories are told, right? The ideology that wealth is good, that home ownership is good, right? That having a very particular family size is maybe good, right? That is a very certain very particular ideology that isn't universal, right? And one of the really good things that we get when we start studying other cultures and ancient texts is we get to the chance to see that our way of looking at the world is not universal, right? That there are other ways that people have seen the world, different ideologies that people have, and these ideologies obviously shape our identity, right? Who we say we are as a people, right? Because as Americans, we, in a sense, share a particular identity because we've grown up with national stories, right? There aren't just the stories that our parents tell us, but there are stories that our nation kind of tells, right? About revolutions and civil rights and things like this. These are national stories that we share and shape our identity as a people. And so when we look at those national stories, we can kind of get a better picture of who we are as a people. And we can do the same with the Deuteronomistic history for ancient Israel. So that's what we're going to be looking at for this next section. So when we look at Joshua through 2 Kings, we get a very particular shaping of history. But like I said, this is found primarily, if we look at Deuteronomy, right? Looking just at that book, we can kind of see where the rest of Joshua through Kings is coming from, right? Because those books are shaped by the perspective that's presented in Deuteronomy. Right? This is why we call it the Deuteronomistic history. Right? And there's a very particular ideology and theology to that. Now, before we get into that, like what just that ideology is, let's talk about kind of the books that are included and how we can kind of think about them. Right? So we have the books. Like I said, we have Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. And I'm actually just going to throw, sorry if you guys were writing that. I'm going to throw Deuteronomy up here too. Right? These are the books that are kind of, when we talk about the Deuteronomistic history, we are kind of talking about Joshua through 2 Kings. I just kind of want to put Deuteronomy up there because it kind of plays into a certain way of looking at this history. Okay? So when we're looking at big thematic movements within these books, in Deuteronomy, who's speaking in Deuteronomy? Yeah, good. This is remember this is the farewell address by Moses, kind of like summing up Israel's history up to this point. So this is Moses speaking. In Joshua is kind of thematically about the conquest of Canaan. Okay. And Judges moves into this other kind of time period. We're just going to call life under the Judges for now. And there's a very kind of particular shape that text has that we'll look at next week. Okay. And then finally, here, we're looking at the monarchy. Right? We're looking at Saul and at David and at Solomon. Right through this section. Right? So these are kind of like large thematic sections of these books.
So Moses was speaking in all in Joshua or just
No, this is Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy? Okay.
Yeah. Now, if we're trying to figure out historically where these books line up, let's say historically, right? In Deuteronomy, yes, we get Moses. This is just kind of a recap. However, Joshua and Judges potentially is seen as one, is seen as narrating the same piece of history from two different perspectives. Okay? And we're going to talk about this tomorrow. Sorry, Friday. We'll call it Israel's appearance in the land. And we'll talk tomorrow about why I'm saying appearance in the land. Okay? Then, 1st and 2nd Samuel kind of give us this picture of a united monarchy. Right? The kingdoms being united under one king. In 1 Kings, we move into a divided kingdom, divided monarchy. And that continues through 2 Kings, which ends with the exile. Okay. So this is the whole history that we're going to be looking at when we start looking at Joshua through Kings. Right? Israel's appearance in the land, the emergence of the monarchy, the dissolution of the monarchy into two separate kingdoms, and eventually the exile. Okay. This is kind of historically what we'll be looking at through these books. I know it's okay if it's off camera. Okay. We also talk about Joshua through Kings kind of as a chunk because there's a lot of similarities that all these books share, right? There's stylistic similarities. There's flowery and wordy language. You get these phrases that pop up again and again that say things like, you, your sons and daughters, your maidservants and your maidservants and menservants, right? Like that whole chunk, like it's repeated a lot through all of these different books. We get things like the land which Yahweh your God is giving you to inherit. That whole chunk reappears and reappears. And with all your heart and with all your soul shows up again and again. So we get these like kind of recurrent themes or recurrent like motifs that pop up. There's also structural devices. In a lot of the Deuteronomistic history, what we'll see are these big speeches that get put in the mouth of leaders. Right? So we'll have these like political or military leaders that will give these big speeches, and that's pretty indicative of the DH as well. We get things like certain formulas and patterns that will show up. And we'll see this especially when we look at judges. There's this kind of recurring pattern that every judge kind of fits into really well. And so it's interesting to consider that pattern of judges and how much we can look at the whole pattern of Joshua through Kings in that light. But let's move into the thematic, what's thematically interesting about the Deuteronomistic history. I'm just going to kind of move these out of the way. Right, look at what some of these dreams might look like. Okay. The first one, and a major one for the Deuteronomistic history, is that Israel's success or failure depends on obedience to the Torah. Say Yahweh as well. Right? Their success or failure as a nation, right? You could even say, because this isn't individual success or failure, right? The Deuteronomistic history is very much concerned with the nation of Israel as a whole, as a group of people, the identity of this group of people. And notice how different that is from maybe what we were looking at with Genesis through Leviticus and Numbers, right, where we have these stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that are very much focused on these individuals. Here, when we're talking about the Deuteronomistic history, we're talking about the nation of Israel. So their success or failure is going to depend on their obedience. Okay? Now, this eventually gets kind of focused down even to centralized worship, to Israel's faithfulness to centralized their worship. Right? Which eventually then gets put onto worship at the temple. And where's the temple? Good, or Jerusalem, yeah. So in one sense, we can see the success or failure depending upon obedience. Obedience gets very much focused onto proper worship, and worship gets focused onto the temple, right? American society has done the same kind of thing, right? With, for example, and this has been in the past, I mean, ever since I've been teaching this class, think of, we have this, in the U.S., we have this idea of, I'll just say freedom, right? And the whole idea of freedom has then been focused onto, was this constitutional? Constitution, right? And some have even taken this whole idea of the Constitution and whittled it down, just for example, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, to the whole Second Amendment, right? If we can't carry guns, then we've thrown out the whole Constitution and we have no freedom, right? So even that same movement has taken place within American society and American culture. That for some people to get rid of the Second Amendment throws all of this out the window. And what we see in the Deuteronomistic history is that that happens with the temple. If we're not worshiping at the temple, then we're not worshiping properly because it's not centralized. We're not all coming in one place, and we're no longer obedient. And therefore, we're subject to being punished by Yahweh for failing to be obedient people. You guys kind of see how that works? That gets narrowed down to where things really hinge on this. So that's a huge thing that we see with the Deuteronomistic history. Another thing that we get is this idea that, I'm going to kind of have to move over here. You're going to get kind of gross looking on the board here. But Yahweh is the sole land grantor. What does that mean? What's that? And only one that can take it. Remember when we read in Deuteronomy this idea that the Israelites cannot get into the land because I think it says something along the lines of the wickedness of the Canaanites has not yet been fulfilled, right? So in other words, Yahweh is this kind of landlord that is waiting for the Canaanites to just do enough that he can kick them out of the land and give it to Israel, right? And that's going to play into this idea as well. If Israel is not obedient, right, then Yahweh has the right to kick them out of the land, right? And this is how they're going to try to make sense of their exile, right? Their exile is due to the fact that they failed in being obedient, and so Yahweh was able to kick them out of the land, right? Sorry, hold on one second. Jay?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think they're talking to me. Sorry.
So, was he talking about the Canaanites or Israel?
In Deuteronomy, we see it with the Canaanites.
Canaanites.
Right? He's waiting for the Canaanites to be wicked enough so he can kick them out and give it to Israel.
Okay.
However, later on, we see Israel kind of narrating their story as saying, we've been wicked and we've been disobedient, and so Yahweh is justifiably kicking us out of the land. Okay? And the last thing we get, the last kind of major thing, is the Davidic kingship. Or sorry, the Davidic, we'll say Davidic covenant. And we'll put kingship here as well. In the Davidic covenant, we'll see just how important this is for the history of Israel. Yeah?
Did you want me to tell you at 15 minutes?
We got 15?
Yes,
Or
sir.
a little after? Okay, cool, thank you. Right? What we're going to see too with the Deuteronomistic history is not a wholehearted endorsement of kingship. The text is really ambivalent about kingship. It goes back and forth between supporting this idea that yes, Israel should have a king because we have David, we need to support this kingship. And then there's other parts of the text to kind of maintain this minority voice that says, no, Israel can't have a king, because the only proper king that Israel should have is Yahweh. And so the text is really ambivalent. It goes back and forth between these two ideas. And we'll kind of see that play out. And so one thing that's good to remember in kind of thinking about how ambivalent the text is about kingship is while the Deuteronomistic history does kind of present a ideology and an identity for Israel, it is somewhat of a mosaic of traditions. Okay, we do see minority voices talking about things like kingship and presenting a different perspective on what it means for Israel to have a king and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And so it'll be important to remember that there are kind of minority voices within the Deuteronomistic history. Also in the sense of how Israel is taking the land. Is it conquest, as Joshua presents it? Or is Judges actually giving us a different perspective on how Israel came to be in the land? Right? Is Judges that maintaining of another tradition within the Israelite people that kind of just presents a different story, a different narrative for how Israel came to be in the land? So that'll be something that'll be really important to remember when we start looking at this. That yes, we're looking at all of these books that are within the Hebrew Bible, but that doesn't mean that they're trying to smooth over differences in traditions and present one single narrative. Right? In the same way that we saw when we looked at the Torah, right? When we looked at, okay, here's a couple different flood narratives. Okay, here's a couple different creation narratives. Right? Because for these authors and for the editors and for the Israelite people, there's a huge importance to kind of maintain these traditions that have come together, rather than like saying, oh, well, this tradition isn't important. We'll kind of smooth over that one so that we can present this one unified story. Right? Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah.
So like before Samuel and Joshua and Judges, was that like their attempt at a theocracy, and the judges were kind of like what kept that together?
In a sense, we'll look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll look at that. Hopefully, by the end of this section, you'll be able to kind of have a better answer to that question. But it'll take all of this to get us there. Yeah. So another way, just one more thing before we kind of talk about it. Remember how we've said we've used a lot of different kind of phrases to talk about what kind of genre we're looking at here. We've talked about myth. We've talked about pneuma history, which is kind of more concerned with shaping future generations than accurately depicting old ones. One way we can look at the Deuteronomistic history is as preached history. And I say preached history because it wants to tell the audience how to be obedient. Right? It wants to tell the audience, here's what happens when you aren't obedient. Here's what failure looks like. Here's what obedience looks like, and here's how we achieve it. And here's kind of the good that comes from being obedient. Right? So think of the Deuteronomistic history as preached history, trying to influence the audience in order to be an obedient people. Right? Because this history, some of this was written in exile. Right? So there's the hope that if we can communicate to the people through the telling of these stories how to be obedient, maybe we can then regain the land. Maybe Yahweh will give us the land back if we can just tell this story in such a way to influence people to be obedient.